I hadn't planned on going back to that hospital, not after everything. But there I was, 63 years old, standing in the parking lot of Street Michael's in a January that felt colder than most, watching my breath disappear into the gray morning air, trying to remember why I'd come. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm a retired civil engineer from Sudbury, Ontario. I spent 35 years calculating load tolerances and stress points on bridges. I was good at it because I don't panic. I look at the structure, I find the weakness, and I work the problem. That's how I've lived my whole life. Quietly, methodically, without drama, which is probably why, when my wife of 22 years handed me divorce papers on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2018, I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and read every page twice. Her name was Patricia. We'd met in the late 90s at a Canada Day barbecue at a mutual friend's place in Lively. She was 41 then, recently returned from 7 years working abroad in finance. I was 40, freshly out of a long relationship that had ended quietly. We made sense together, people said. Steady, practical, compatible. I believed them. For a long time, I believed that. We had one son together, Marcus, born in 2001. I was in the delivery room. I cut the cord. I drove home that night at 4 a.m. with my hands shaking on the wheel, not from fear, but from something I'd never felt before. A kind of awe that I still can't properly name. Marcus grew up to be a thoughtful, quiet kid. Hockey until 13, then lost interest. Picked up woodworking in high school, which I loved. He had Patricia's dark hair and her way of tilting his head when he was thinking through a problem. He didn't look much like me, but children often don't, and I never thought twice about it. Why would I? The divorce was Patricia's decision. She said she'd been unhappy for years. She said I was emotionally unavailable. She said a lot of things that I processed slowly, the way I do everything, and by the time I'd formed a real response, the lawyers were already involved. Marcus was 17 when we separated. He stayed with his mother in the house in Sudbury. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near the Flour Mill neighborhood, about 12 minutes away. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. It lasted 4 years. I saw Marcus every second weekend at first, then less. Patricia didn't obstruct the visits exactly, but she had a way of scheduling things that made them inconvenient. A hockey tournament, a cousin's birthday, a camping trip I wasn't told about until after. By the time Marcus turned 19 and started college at Laurentian, the visits had become phone calls, and the phone calls had become texts, and the texts had become the kind of short, polite exchanges that people have when they're not sure what to say to each other anymore. I told myself it was normal. Young men pull away from their fathers. I'd done it myself at that age. It comes back. I kept telling myself it comes back. What I didn't know was that during those years, Patricia had been telling Marcus things. I found this out much later. She'd told him I had never really wanted children, that I'd resented the pregnancy, that I'd only stayed as long as I had, out of obligation. None of it was true. But Marcus was a teenager hearing it from his mother, in his childhood home, surrounded by familiar things. What was he supposed to do with that? I found out what she'd said, the same way I found out about almost everything important in the last decade of my life slowly, and from someone other than her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In the spring of 2022, Marcus was 21. I hadn't seen him in person in almost 8 months. We'd exchanged a few texts around Christmas, a birthday message from him in February that was warm enough to give me hope, and then silence again. I'd stopped pushing. I was 61 years old, and I'd learned that pushing rarely opens doors that aren't ready to open. Then in April I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a nurse at Health Sciences North. She identified herself carefully, asked me to confirm I was Gerald Whitmore, and then told me that my son Marcus had been admitted 4 days earlier. She said he'd listed me as his emergency contact. I was out the door before I finished writing down the ward number. Marcus had listed me. After 8 months of near silence, after years of distance, after everything Patricia had apparently told him, he'd still put my name down as the person to call if things went wrong. I didn't know what to do with that information except drive faster. He was in a room on the 4th floor, in a bed by the window. He looked thin in a way that wasn't right. He'd lost weight I didn't know he'd had to lose. His eyes, when they opened, were his mother's dark brown, and they went through about 6 different emotions in the space of 3 seconds when he saw me walk in. I sat down next to him without making a speech about it. I put my hand on his arm. That was all. He'd been having symptoms for 3 months. Fatigue that wouldn't lift. Night sweats. Bruising that appeared without explanation. He'd attributed it to stress, to his part-time job, to the end of a relationship. His family doctor had ordered blood work twice. The second panel had flagged something that sent him to a hematologist, and the hematologist had admitted him within 48 hours of seeing the results. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. ALL, they call it. More common in children, but not unheard of in young adults. Treatable, in many cases, but aggressively so. The treatment itself is its own ordeal. His oncologist was a woman named Dr. Anand, calm and precise in the way that good doctors often are when delivering news that would make anyone else's voice shake. She explained the treatment plan to Marcus and to me together, since Marcus had specifically asked that I be there. That mattered to me more than I knew how to say. I just sat and listened and took notes on my phone the way I used to take notes in engineering meetings, because it was the only thing I knew how to do that felt useful. Patricia arrived on the second day. She walked into the room and saw me sitting in the chair beside Marcus's bed, and I watched her face go through a series of calculations. She recovered quickly. She kissed Marcus on the forehead, asked him how he was feeling, and sat down on the other side of the bed. We were polite to each other in the way that people are when the stakes are too high for anything less. Over the following weeks, as Marcus began his first round of chemotherapy, the question of a bone marrow transplant came up. Dr. Anand explained that, depending on his response to the initial treatment, a transplant might become the best path forward. She recommended that close biological relatives be tested for compatibility as early as possible, since finding a match could take time. I volunteered immediately. So did Patricia. Siblings were the best candidates statistically, but Marcus had none. Biological parents were the next option, and we were there, so we were tested. I remember sitting in the clinic for the blood draw, filling out the paperwork, checking boxes about my medical history. The woman processing my intake was efficient and kind. She told me results would take about 2 weeks. I thanked her and went back upstairs to sit with Marcus, who was sleeping off the nausea from his second round of chemo and didn't know I was there. I didn't think about the test results much over those 2 weeks. I had other things to focus on. Marcus had good days and bad days. On the good days, we talked more than we had in years. He told me about his program, about the friends he'd made, about a girl he'd been seeing who'd sent him 3 care packages since his admission. On the bad days, I sat nearby and didn't ask him to perform wellness he didn't have. Patricia and I had developed a kind of truce around his bedside. We didn't speak about our marriage or our divorce or anything that had happened between us. We spoke about Marcus and only Marcus, and for a while, that was almost enough to make us functional. The call came on a Thursday morning in early June. I was at home, having coffee, reading a report about a rail infrastructure project I'd been consulted on in retirement. The number was from Health Sciences North. It was Dr. Anand's assistant. She said the doctor would like to meet with me in person at my earliest convenience. I asked if it was about the compatibility results. There was a brief pause, and she said yes, and that the doctor felt it would be better to discuss in person. I knew, in the way that you know things you don't want to know yet, that something was off. I drove to the hospital the next morning. Dr. Anand met me in a small consultation room, not in Marcus's ward. She had a colleague with her, a genetics specialist named Dr. Osei, who I hadn't met before. They both sat down, and Dr. Anand put a folder on the table and looked at me the way she looks at people when she's about to say something that has no comfortable way in. She said the compatibility testing had returned unexpected results. She said that in processing the samples, the genetics lab had run standard markers as part of the protocol. She said that based on those markers, there was a significant inconsistency. Then she said it plainly, because she was that kind of doctor. The results indicated that I was not Marcus's biological father. I sat with that for a moment the way you sit with a structural calculation that has come out wrong. You go back to the inputs. You check the formula, you look for where the error entered. I asked her to repeat it. She did. Dr. Osei explained the science carefully and without condescension. He said the markers were clear. He said there was no scenario in which the result was a lab error, because they had run the panel 3 times, using 2 separate sample draws. He said he understood this was unexpected information, and that I was under no obligation to do anything with it, beyond what was medically relevant. Medically relevant. I fixed on that phrase. Medically, what it meant was that I was not a suitable donor candidate for Marcus because a parent must share certain genetic markers to have meaningful compatibility, and I did not share those markers with him. It also meant that wherever Marcus's biological father was, he might. I drove home in a state I'm not sure I have a name for. Not rage, not grief. Exactly. Something quieter than both. I sat in my apartment for 3 hours without turning on any lights. 22 years. I had been married to Patricia for 22 years. Marcus was born in 2001, 3 years into our marriage. We had never separated before that point. We had not, as far as I'd known, had any crisis in those early years of any significance. We had been, as far as I had known, faithful to each other. As far as I had known. I've since learned that there's a particular kind of grief that has no public shape. When a spouse dies, there are rituals. When a marriage ends, there is at least a recognizable form of loss. But when you learn, at 61 years old, that the son you raised from birth, whose hockey equipment you drove across northern Ontario 4 winters in a row, whose woodworking projects still sit on a shelf in your apartment, is not biologically yours, there is no form for that. No card, no casserole from the neighbors, no language that quite fits. I did not tell anyone for 2 weeks. What I did was call Dr. Anand's office and ask what the next steps were medically. She connected me with Dr. Osei again. He explained that if they were going to pursue a biological relative donor search, they would need to identify Marcus's biological father. He said they could help facilitate that conversation with Marcus if and when I was ready to have it. He said they had a social worker on staff for exactly these situations. Exactly these situations. I wondered how many of those there were. I kept visiting Marcus during those 2 weeks. I sat with him. I helped him with the small logistics of being hospitalized, picking up things he needed, dealing with his landlord about his apartment, watering a plant he was worried about. I did not tell him what I'd learned. He had enough to carry. I was not going to add to the weight until I absolutely had to. Patricia knew before Marcus did. I drove to the house in Sudbury, her house now, from the settlement on a Saturday afternoon in late June, and I knocked on the door, and she answered in a way that suggested she had not expected me to appear. I didn't make her guess why I was there. I told her what the doctors had found. I watched her face, and in her face I saw something I hadn't expected. Not surprise. The absence of surprise. She started to say something about how DNA tests aren't always reliable. I told her these ones had been run 3 times by 2 separate labs, and that her son had leukemia, and that finding his biological father might save his life. So I needed her to be honest with me now, specifically now, with no more of what we'd been doing for the past 4 years. She was quiet for a long time. Then she told me, in 2000, about a year before Marcus was born, Patricia had been in contact with a man she'd worked with during her years abroad. They'd met again at a conference in Toronto. She said it had only happened once. She said she hadn't been certain. She said she'd told herself there was no reason to believe Marcus wasn't mine. She said she'd told herself this for 21 years. His name was Alan Sherwood. She had a last known address in Hamilton. I wrote it down. I thanked her, which I think surprised her more than anything I could have said. Then I left. What I did with Alan Sherwood's name is the part of this story I am most careful about telling, because I don't want to make it sound like a confrontation or a drama, because it wasn't either of those things. It was one of the stranger conversations I've ever had, and I've had some strange ones. I found him through a combination of the address Patricia had given me and a professional directory for the consulting sector he worked in. He was 64, semi-retired, lived in Hamilton with his wife of many years, had 2 adult daughters. His LinkedIn photo showed a man who looked, in certain undeniable ways, like Marcus around the jaw and the eyes. I called him. I didn't introduce myself as Patricia's ex-husband. I introduced myself as the person who'd raised her son and needed to speak with him about something medical. I told him the situation plainly. His name had come up in a paternity question connected to a young man who currently had leukemia and needed a bone marrow donor. He was silent for a very long time. Then he said, "How old is he?" I said 21. Another long silence. He said he would come to Sudbury. He drove up 2 days later. We met in a coffee shop on Elm Street, just the 2 of us, before anything else happened. I've thought about that meeting many times since. What I expected was awkwardness, or defensiveness, or the kind of man who was going to make this complicated. What I got was a 64-year-old engineer, as it happened, who sat across from me and said that he had not known, and that if what I was telling him was true, he wanted to do whatever was medically needed. He was tested the next day. He was a strong match. I was the one who told Marcus. Not about everything at once. First about the donor search, then about Alan Sherwood. Then, carefully, the rest. Dr. Anand's social worker was in the room. I sat next to Marcus, and I told him that the testing had found something unexpected, and that there was a man who might be his biological father, and who was willing to donate. Marcus looked at me for a long time after I finished speaking. Then he said, "Are you still my dad?" I said yes, without hesitation, because that question had only one answer, and I'd known it before he finished asking. He cried then, which I wasn't prepared for, and I put my hand on his arm again, the same way I had when I first walked into his room, and we just sat there for a while with the monitors beeping quietly and the light coming in sideways through the window, and neither of us said anything else for quite some time. The transplant took place that October. There were complications, the way there often are. A secondary infection in November that was frightening for about 10 days. A long, slow recovery through the winter. By February of 2023, Marcus was in remission. By June, his doctors were cautiously optimistic. By the following spring, he was back in his workshop, building things again. Alan Sherwood and Marcus have met twice since the transplant. They're not close, and I don't know if they will be, but they're in contact. Alan sends the occasional message. Marcus responds. It is what it is, and Marcus gets to decide what it becomes. Patricia and I have not spoken much since June of 2022 beyond what was necessary for Marcus's medical decisions. There's a particular kind of reckoning that happens after a discovery like that, and it is not public, and it is not linear. I spent a long time being angry. Then I spent a long time not being angry and not knowing what to do with the quiet that left behind. Now I mostly think about Marcus, about the woodworking, about what he's building, what I've carried from all of this, and what I find myself saying when people ask me, and more people have asked than I expected, because these things have a way of becoming stories that travel, is that fatherhood is a daily thing. It is the driving and the sitting and the plant watering and the notepad and the phone calls you make when you don't know what else to do. Genetics are real, and they matter, clearly. They saved my son's life. But genetics told me what Marcus's body needed in a medical crisis. They did not tell me whose child he was. That I already knew. There's something that doesn't get said often enough about families that have been through betrayal, and it's this. The person who is deceived is not diminished by the deception. I know men who have been in situations similar to mine who spent years feeling like fools, like they should have known, like the wool had been pulled over their eyes, and the shame of that was somehow theirs to carry. I want to say clearly that it is not. Being honest and trusting your partner and not conducting background investigations into the people you love is not a character flaw. It is just the ordinary risk of loving someone. What you do when the ground shifts, that's the part you actually control. I also want to say something about the medical side of this, because I think it matters, and I didn't understand it before it happened to me. In rare cases, a parent who has raised a child from birth can be an entirely incompatible bone marrow donor, not because of any fault or illness, but simply because biology doesn't follow the stories we tell about our families. If you are ever in a situation where a loved one needs a donor search, I would encourage you not to make assumptions about who will or won't be a match. Let the medicine do the work. Let the testing be thorough. Sometimes the answer comes from a direction you weren't looking. And if you find yourself on the receiving end of information you didn't expect and didn't want, give yourself the full weight of whatever you feel. Don't rush past it. I sat in a dark apartment for 3 hours, and I needed every one of them. Then get up, get back to the hospital, find out what needs to be done next, and go do it. That's all there is, really. You keep showing up, even when showing up is the hardest thing, especially then. Marcus came home for Thanksgiving last year. He brought the girl who'd sent the care packages, whose name is Sophie, and who makes him laugh in a way I hadn't heard from him in years. We had dinner at my apartment, which I'd cleaned more carefully than I usually bother to. I made a roast the way my mother used to, which I'd called her to get the recipe for 3 days earlier. After dinner, Marcus helped me with the dishes, and we stood in the kitchen talking about nothing in particular, a project he was working on, a documentary he'd watched, whether I was going to replace my winter tires before the first snowfall. Just two people in a kitchen. His kitchen now, too, if he ever wants it.